Alright, now that we've got a little bit clearer picture of exactly what we're talking about when we refer to a medical definition of death, what that definition has to be like, and that sort of thing, let's just briefly take a look at how this definition has evolved in medicine. We're going to be inspired here in our discussion by the piece by Peter Singer entitled How Death Was Redefined. But we also want to just be clear about different ways that death has been defined in medicine. So what might be described as the old standard, or the cardiopulmonary standard, very simply says that an individual is dead when the heart and lungs cease to function. So no longer moving blood around the body and no more respiration. And this is going to be permanent cessation, right? We're not talking about a person who flatlines and then is resuscitated. We're talking about the permanent cessation of heart and lung functioning. Now, this is a useful standard in a lot of cases, right? This tells us in sort of a non-medical setting when a person is dead. It helps us sort of confirm cases where we're confident that the person really is dead. But it's problematic in a medical setting, in part because we're not quite sure what it tells us about people on respirators. Their heart and lungs are functioning. It's just that they're functioning with a certain kind of assistance. And so it's not obvious whether these folks are dead or not on the cardiopulmonary standard. And we'll talk more in just a minute about why this problem led to the redefinition of death, or the adopting of a different standard. But first, let's take a look at what might be called the new brain death standard. Now, this is also often referred to as whole brain death, and you can define that as just the permanent cessation of all brain function. And what I've given you here are kind of the criteria that are utilized for determining when a person is dead according to this whole brain standard. People who experience whole brain death are completely unreceptive. They don't respond to anything. They don't move or breathe in any way. They have no reflex responses, so when you bang on their knee, they don't kick out, things like that. And when you hook them up to an electroencephalograph, which measures certain kinds of brain activity, you don't detect any. Complete what's called a flat electroencephalograph. And these indicators are supposed to tell us that there is no brain function, and that this is going to be permanent. The whole brain death standard says that's when a person is dead, is when they have permanent cessation of all brain function. We'll talk more about some problems with this in a few minutes, but first let's just notice, you might be tempted to think, oh, he's talking about persistent vegetative states. We're talking about Terri Schiavo type of stuff here. This definition says those people are dead. Not exactly. Let's look at the difference between brain death and persistent vegetative states. And we'll just sort of work back and forth between these two columns. So we'll start on the left here. In the case of brain death, the person is unreceptive and unresponsive. Persons in persistent vegetative states occasionally move, and they sometimes seem to be responding. It's sort of a live debate whether what they're doing is responding to just sort of stimulus in the room, or to the people in the room, or what's going on. But they do move about a bit. They just don't do it over prolonged periods of time. They're not motionless, and they're not completely unresponsive in the way that people who are dead according to the whole brain standard are. No breathing whatsoever in the case of whole brain death. That's another sort of important difference, because for patients in persistent vegetative states, they often have brainstem function, and that allows for autonomic bodily functions, including breathing. So people who are in persistent vegetative states are frequently not on respirators or ventilators of any kind. They can breathe on their own. That's not the case for people with whole brain death. They're not capable of breathing. Same type of thing for whole brain death versus for reflex responses. Whole brain death, no reflex responses. But for people in persistent vegetative states, there is some reflex response. People in persistent vegetative states also have sleep and wake cycles that can be sort of measured. And they have intermittent periods of actually being awake. Their eyes are open and things like that, for example. Now, it's not aware that they are aware of it's not clear they're aware of their surroundings. They can't do anything to sort of respond to you and let you know that they actually understand what you're saying or even know that you're there, but they do look awake. I mean, they do go to sleep for periods of the day, and they do wake up. So that's one thing that's important to keep in mind. This is going to be important later, because later we're going to look at the higher brain criterion of death, and that standard does say that people in persistent vegetative states are dead. The whole brain death standard does not, so it's important that early on here we are clear about the difference between whole brain death and persistent vegetative states, because otherwise the later dispute about higher brain death is not going to make any sense. So the point is that whole brain death is not the same as a persistent vegetative state. It's important to keep in mind. All right, before we look at the Harvard Committee's rationale for why we switched to the whole brain death standard, let's just talk briefly about a couple of historical developments that led to this shift in medicine. This comes up in the Singer piece. Basically, we saw, Singer says, two important developments in the sort of post-World War II and then moving into the 60s and early 70s. First was the development of the respirator. Now, this was obviously a great achievement for medicine. It really helped patients. A lot of patients that never would have survived now are able to survive. But it had this sort of surprising problem, which is that it created the possibility of patients who had no chance for recovery, but they could be kept alive more or less indefinitely. You can sort of keep them breathing and keep them functioning at a level where they will continue to survive. So that's one concern. What we want to notice here is that not only is this not beneficial for the patient, but it's really hard on the family. It's very taxing on the hospitals where these patients were. It's hard on the medical staff. It's just sort of it created a great burden for a lot of people that the respirator made this possible for people to just be unable to recover but able to be kept alive more or less indefinitely. So that was one sort of important technological development that led to this shift. And the other was the first successful heart transplant in 1967. This opened up this world of possibility that we're now in today and that we continue to sort of expand further into, where we can save lives by transplanting new organs into people whose organs have been damaged. Now this is where it's important to think about the dead donor rule, because the dead donor rule says that we can't get, we've got this sort of supply of individuals who are not going to recover, but they're still, they're all but dead, but they're on a respirator, technically still counting as alive, and at the same time we have this sudden need for all sorts of organs for transplant. And the thought is, wouldn't it be nice if we could get those people's organs? I mean, they're more or less ideal candidates. They're much better than sort of taking organs from accident victims who, arrive dead, because the physical body of a person in this sort of unconscious state where they're being sustained by a respirator, the physical body is still alive. It's still sort of supporting the systems of the body to a point that the organs are in a much more ideal condition to be removed and transplanted. The problem is that the dead donor rule says, look, unless those people are dead, you can't take their organs. And Singer says that these sort of two factors led to a report given by the Harvard Committee that basically advocated redefining death to allow for organs to be taken from these individuals. And I'm actually going to just sort of read the content of this to you because it's really interesting. I'm trying to highlight a couple of important points. First, the Harvard Committee said that improvements in resuscitative and supportive measures, that's the respirators, have led to increased efforts to save those who are desperately injured. Sometimes these efforts have only a partial success, so the resultant is an individual whose heart continues to beat but whose brain is irreversibly damaged. In other words, we've got people who are still technically alive, we're keeping them alive on respirators, but they're not going to recover. Their brain is too severely destroyed. And the burden, the Harvard Committee said, is great on patients who suffer permanent loss of intellect. Now, strictly speaking, that can't be true, because these folks are completely unaware of their surroundings. They have no brain activity to speak of. So there's no sense in which this is burdensome for them. But it's a nice piece of rhetoric. It makes you think. It helps the Harvard Committee convince you of what they're trying to argue for. However, it's probably true that these patients are a great burden on their families, the hospitals, and those in need of hospital beds. So that was one of the reasons, according to the Harvard Committee, that we ought to opt for a different definition of death. And the other is that an obsolete criteria for the definition of death can lead to controversy in obtaining organs for transplantation. In other words, we would be better able to transplant organs and sort of alleviate this problem of not having enough transplant organs if we were able to take organs from these individuals. Now, there are two things that are shocking about this. And on the basis of these two reasons, the Harvard Committee said we should adopt the whole brain standard of death. Two things that are shocking about this that you should take note of. One is just, there's nothing here about the old definition actually being wrong, right? What they're not saying, look, hospitals are full of people on respirators, and those people are all dead. And our definition should reflect the fact that those people are dead. This is appealing to burdens on families, burdens on the medical community, a need for more transplant organs. There's nothing there about the cardiopulmonary standard actually being wrong. You might think that that's surprising, right? You might think that, look, the definition of death medicine should adopt is the one that's correct. That's not what's being advocated here. They're talking about something different. Now, another strange thing about this report is that it makes a lot of reference to what they call irreversible coma, and they describe that as identical with the death of the whole brain. But persistent vegetative states are often a state of irreversible coma, and we don't think those people are dead. You might also think that these reasons, burden on families and the medical community, chance to get more organs, those all apply to patients in a persistent vegetative state as well. So the concern here is, there are a couple. One is just that what is being described as irreversible coma doesn't obviously reflect this definition of whole brain death that this report is supposed to be telling us we ought to adopt. And the other concern is just that if these are the reasons why we ought to adopt the whole brain standard, it's not clear why we shouldn't adopt a standard that also declares patients in a persistent vegetative state dead. So the point here is just there are a number of strange things about the Harvard Committee's discussion and their rationale. It seems to apply to cases that they didn't intend it to apply to. Their rationale doesn't obviously correspond to the definition that they advocated. But the most striking thing about this report and this argument, at least according to Singer, and I think he's onto something here, is just that there's nothing here about this definition being wrong. Like, the reasons are practical. They're not theoretical. The issue is not that we've got hospitals full of dead people and we don't realize that they're dead. It has more to do with these sort of technological developments that promoted this. Okay, go ahead and complete the question. It's about the differences between persistent vegetative states and whole brain death, just making sure you understand how those are different, because that's going to be important later when we look at the piece by David DeGrazia, where he argues against higher brain standards of death. And once you complete that, we'll just talk a little bit about some problems with the whole brain standard of death, as well as what Singer thinks is a really surprising lack of opposition to this shift when it occurred.